Has the Christian fundamentalists proven the case that Moses did indeed part the Red Sea? Stay tuned and we'll see if I'm going to reconvert, at least to Judaism, based on this so-called evidence, showing once again that a myth from the Old Testament is actually based in reality. Have you ever noticed that when you're arguing with an evangelical or other Christian fundamentalist about the lack of authenticity in the Old Testament stories and fables, that no matter how much science you bring to the table, all the genres of science for that matter, no matter how much historical text that conflicts with the fundamentalist worldview, no matter how much you show that those stories were most likely borrowed from other earlier cultures, it falls on the deaf ears of the fundamentalist. You always get the same response. They claim we have researchers too. However, their researchers aren't peer-reviewed. Their researchers don't actually have evidence that's been validated. Their claims that prove the authenticity of the Old Testament are nothing short of absurd. And I'm going to use an example of this as the parting of the Red Sea myth. And that's what it is. It is a myth. The Red Sea that parted to let the ancient Hebrews escape from the Pharaoh in Egypt. Because I have heard the same claim from fundamentalists that their researchers do indeed prove that the parting of the Red Sea actually happened, the ancient Israelites crossed it, and then the sea closed on the entire Egyptian army, drowning them all orchestrated by Moses' outstretched hand and God above. And I'm going to use this as an example of how illogical the Christian fundamentalist mind actually is. Because as said, they don't actually present real evidence. None of them actually ever fact check anything. They just hear an apologist say it and they run with it. And they all follow the exact same pattern. So-called evidence that's not credible but fits into their worldview is to be absolutely believed, but real concrete evidence that doesn't fit into their worldview must be disregarded. Now, if you'd like a quick example of this, about 10 years ago, there was an article that came from the World News Daily Report, claiming that a bunch of exploratory scuba divers, while looking for ancient shipwrecks or something of the like, accidentally found the remains of an Egyptian army buried under the Red Sea. I believe the area was actually in the Gulf of Suez. They claim that approximately 1.5 kilometers offshore, hundreds of skeletons, Egyptian weapons, and broken chariots were discovered. They gave an estimate that there could have been as much as 5,000 bodies that drowned there. It was supposedly led by a team from the Cairo University of Archaeology. And I remember a few fundamentalists that I knew hanging on to this discovery to prove that the Red Sea did indeed part, orchestrated by God himself. Well, it turns out that the article was a satire, a hoax, a joke. But the Christian fundamentalist doesn't take the time to actually fact check. As said, it fits their worldview, so they run with it. But there was also supposed evidence that wasn't satirical in nature. There was a man decades ago named Ron Wyatt, whose quote, research and discovery show that Moses did indeed part the Red Sea. And this is the so-called research that most Christian fundamentalists will use to prove the parting of the Red Sea. Well, first, let's look at Ron Wyatt's background. First of all, he's not an archaeologist. He was by trade a nurse anesthetist, but yet he's the president of Wyatts Archeological Research as a non-archaeologist. I would like to know how that works, Christian fundamentalist. And apparently Ron Wyatt has stumbled on all sorts of evidence proving the legitimacy of the Old Testament. He claims to have found the landing site of Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, even the remains of the blood of Christ himself. Why, he's just a regular Indiana Jones, except at least the fictional Indiana Jones was a professor in the movie. And I'll give an example of a Christian apologist using this so-called research as a platform to prove that the Red Sea did indeed part. This is an article written in 2007 by Jim Mulhausen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a Christian apologist. He claims that Mr. Wyatt presented an 8-spoke chariot wheel hub that was retrieved from the site in an area called the Nuweiba Beach. He claims that this wheel hub was presented to the director of Egyptian antiquities, and that after inspecting the wheel, was declared that it was an authentic 8-spoke wheel only used during the 18th Egyptian dynasty, the dynasty that dated to the time of Exodus. And then he claims that another man, Mr. Aaron Sen, explored the Nuweiba Beach in 1998. and he yielded a 4-spoke chariot wheel and dozens of human bones. One of the bones supposedly submitted to Stockholm University for inspection, where it was determined to be a femur bone from the right leg of a man 165 to 170 centimeters tall. And then in 2003, 2 brothers conducted 2 diving expeditions, again at the Nueva Beach, and they found in their scuba diving what was described as an underwater scrapyard that was, quote, most definitely the remains of an Egyptian army. So Mr. Mulhausen claims that the only explanation, the only reasonable explanation, is that this is the site of some sort of disaster that could only have been God parting the Red Sea. As found in Exodus 14, he states. He says, and I quote, "How else can you explain human and horse skeletal remains, chariot wheels, axles, and boxes, and an 8-spoke Egyptian chariot wheel from the 18th Egyptian dynasty littering the bottom of the Red Sea?" And this will be the sort of reasoning that the Christian apologist uses. Except here's a problem. First of all, Mr. Wyatt's finding of that 8-spoke chariot wheel was never verified by real archaeologists. And maybe somebody can help me out in the comments section, because I never found any evidence that this so-called chariot wheel was presented anywhere, or that the chariot wheel that he claims to have found actually came from the bottom of the Red Sea to begin with, if it exists at all. It was never peer-reviewed and never made available for trained archaeologists. So the question is why? If he was so confident of his findings, how come he didn't want it verified to present to the world? And I'll tell you why. Because I think he's lying through his teeth. Actually, I don't think it, I know it. Coming from the man who claims he found the Ark of Covenant, Noah's landing site, the actual remains of the blood of Christ, give me one reason why I should believe this nonsense at all. I probably didn't even need to research it based on that background, but I did a little bit. In one of my sources, a marine biologist states that this so-called junkyard that they claim to have found that represents many chariot wheels actually not only could be, but probably is, one of many species of coral that are known to grow like a large flat plate with stalk-like projections. Ron Wyatt is apparently well known to actual trained researchers and archaeologists. He's known to have absolutely no authenticity to any of his claims. His claim to have found the Ark of the Covenant was completely debunked, and so is this one. Because this is what I would have expected if an Egyptian army was actually pursuing the ancient Hebrews and actually had the waters from a parted ocean close on them. You have to remember, in the story of Exodus, there were approximately 600,000 males who fled Egypt. That's just the males. If every male had one wife and one child, that would give you approximately 1.8 million people crossing that Red Sea. The Egyptian army that would have been following, even if they were 50% of the strength of the number of just the males, would have had to have been 300,000. But let's just say it was even just 100,000. And every member of that army would have had at least a spear or a sword or some type of pointed weapon, and you would have found massive amounts of those and hundreds of thousands of bones at the bottom of that ocean. Not to mention all the remains of artifacts from supplemental supplies that would have gone down to the bottom with that Egyptian army. The claims of Ron Wyatt have been pretty much debunked by anyone with any training whatsoever. And what if they even did find a few human bones, including that femur of that man? Which I'm not sure if that part is true or not, because it's really not even worth bothering to research if it is. If they found an old femur of a man, so what? It could have been a man swimming who drowned, or was killed by a shark attack, or part of a crew of a boat that sank. How do you equate finding some bones in an ocean with giving legitimacy that an entire Egyptian army perished there? But this is the type of nonsense that the Christian fundamentalist states when he states that we have researchers as well. They act like it's just a different point of view from a collective think tank, when the difference is the real trained researchers have evidence and the Christian fundamentalist researchers have nothing but absurdities. And then they won't let their claims be fact-checked by the real researchers because they know they're going to be proven invalid. And this, friends, is why I call them members of a cult. Because the attempt to prove this fable, that Moses outstretched his hand and parted the Red Sea, is just an example of their illogical reasoning, logical fallacies, complete irrationality, and many times just flat-out lies. And remember, in the fundamentalist schools and homes, this is what they're teaching their children. All the genres of science and research are invalid, and they're invalid because everyone's against Christians, but their rogue nutcases who present this garbage are completely accurate in their findings. I always wonder if I'm going to run out of topics pointing out evangelical and other Christian fundamentalist absurdities. And I don't think I have to worry about running out of topics because you guys make it so easy for me. And if you'd like to read another work of fiction, check out my novel The Second Fall, an offbeat apocalypse sure to offend the fundamentalist. On Amazon, see the link in the description below as well as the banner, and I will see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.